Another world, another time, in the age of wonder.
You are listening to The Dark Crystal Minute.
And begin, all the same, sometimes good, sometimes bad.
And now once more the world must undergo a time of testing.
It is time to return to the castle.
There is much to be learned, and you have no time.
And here's your hosts, Philip Mitchell and JM Prater. Hello and welcome to the Dark Crystal Minute. This is your minute-by-minute discussion on the Dark Crystal. I'm your host, Philip Mitchell, and I'm from Trial by Stone, the Dark Crystal podcast.
And I am JM Prater from Perfect Organism, the Alien Saga podcast, and Shoulder of Orion, the Blade Runner podcast.
All right, so in this episode, we are up to minute 13 of the Dark Crystal. So for those who are new to the program, what we do in each episode is we discuss the Dark Crystal 1 minute at a time. So for this episode, we're up to minute 13, so from the 12th to the 13th minute. And so it's just something that was inspired by, I think, Star Wars Minute. And there's a lot of podcasts out there that do these sort of movies by minute podcasts that are definitely worth checking out. So I guess we'll start with recapping what happens in this minute. So obviously, I mean, in this minute, this is when we see the Emperor skekSo, as he dies, his face crumbles, and, you know, he's sort of the first one to die of these skeksis, and then we go back to see Urso, the master mystic, and he passes away too. So you sort of get a sense of, you know, that there is some kind of connection between the skeksis and the mystic. And then of course Jen mourns of his passing with a voiceover sort of dialogue. He says, "Oh master, I'll go where you send me, though I barely understand." And then it just sort of ends with him sort of his head lowers, in mourning for his master. And then the minute ends with a transition to a mystic playing the harp, or a loom, I should say. And that was Ut the Weaver. That was the name of the mystic who plays the loom. So yeah, I mean that's sort of the wrap up for, that minute. I guess, I mean, that's one of those things, Jamie, like with the with the Skeksis dying, that was like one of the many sort of horrible moments that we probably remember in our childhoods with that scene. Don't you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I remember watching that scene with friends of mine, and I don't think we fully understood what we were watching. I mean, it was gross, it was weird, it was disturbing, but I think we kind of made light of it, me and my friends. I don't know, and I remember kind of laughing about it with this one girl that I was growing up with, and I would put on the voice, and she'd be like, "Jamie, do that voice," and I would pretend like I was the emperor, and I would do, and I would like, "I'm still emperor," whatever, and it was pretty funny. Yeah, I would totally do all of that. And it was just a great time. It was a great memory I have seeing that. Every time I see that scene, I think about being a kid and seeing that and reenacting that for my friends. But it's a very interesting, poignant scene. And as as an adult now, as we were talking and we're going walking ourselves through this film minute by minute, or this film, again, the amount of time spent to create these momentary effects, the amount of time that they spent trying to figure out how they're going to make that emperor crumble and having to do it. I don't know how many times they had to do it. I don't think people fully understand what goes into something like that. You're talking hours and hours and months and months and months of work to figure out that kind of effect, figure out how they're going to do it, and hope that it works. And it worked.
And I just realized, I just had a look through the Dark Crystal Ultimate Visual History book, and which was a great behind-the-scenes book on the making of the Dark Crystal. And so actually how the effect was done was that the Creature Shop, they actually created a version of the Emperor's head, which they made it out of soft clay. And Ian Wingrove, who was the mechanical effects designer on the film, he actually then installed mechanisms in the piece that were attached to a number of thick wires. And then, of course, when pulled, the wires would pull the face apart from the inside. So that was how the effect So that was how the effect was achieved, which is, a very simple way of doing things, but just incredible stuff. And even just you, even watching the Skeksis, they're just like taking a step back as well. Just I think they're even they're a bit shocked at how he's going down.
Yeah,
and then I just love,
that's funny.
And I just love and I just love the wide shot. That all the Skeksis are in shot. With
And they have that look like, oh my God, what's happening?
Yeah, is this going to happen to us next?
I don't want to be emperor.
And like for me, like really the big thing, like just the subtletiness of the performance, and just like even I can just imagine you just being on set, just the amount of movement that they need to do to pull off these performances. And I think one of my examples that I could think of, especially with Jen, with I think the second last shot before the transition, and as you see the Master Mystic sort of passing away and disappearing, and then as you see sort of the blanket sort of falling down, and then you see sort of Jen sort of lowering his head, which just sort of adds, I don't know, it just adds a little bit, not suspension of disbelief, but yeah, just a bit more realism to the world, that this film isn't just creatures and in puppets and whatnot, that everything in the movie feels so real, like
completely, like it's completely authentic. And and the magic of this movie again is because everything is 100% real. Again, as an adult, and maybe because we've seen this film so many times, we're biased by it, but nothing, maybe there's some movements of the pod people that feel kind of fake, but nothing catches my eye as, oh, this isn't real. Like, Jen is a living, breathing thing. And as I'm seeing him lower his head and his arms, the body language of sadness, you also have to understand, or people have to understand, because I know you understand, that there's somebody under the floor operating him, and that there's major, major work happening to create this tiny little subtle nuanced scene. Major, major work happening, where people are coordinating the head and the hands and the ears and the eyes to look down, to move down, to have the body move down in parallel to the disappearance of the Mystic. And then there's the shot where the Mystic is disappearing, and then it cuts to a wider shot, and you see the clothes then falling down, because he's disappeared, like a Jedi. It is unbelievable. It is unbelievable that they pulled this movie off so well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially for that time period. With when they shot this in the late sort of 70s or more early 80s, I should say. It's just incredible, and also I guess even the similarities, like with like this scene, that always sort of I think you and we sort of talked about a bit before, how it sort of reminds us from Return of the Jedi with Yoda, passing away, and then you got Luke on his own sort of thing. I don't know, yeah, they're just both very similar, even though these films came out, different years. Well, The Dark Crystal came out, a couple of months before Return of the Jedi. Yeah, I sort of like those sort of, similarities or some influences or, or whatnot, just an interesting comparison, yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I think when you and I were discussing doing our documentary, we were sharing this scene in photos, how kind of parallel they are, and Jen is in this kind of little hovel as Luke was, and they're both Jen and Luke are both being told kind of this wisdom from their masters, and then their masters at the end of their life disappear. It's very interesting, and even the fabric feels similar. The fabric around that's the blanket around the Mystic Master feels very similar to the fabric that's the blanket that's over Yoda. They just feel like Dagobah could be another world over from Thra,
And even just like the design, like even on that blanket, you see that the shapes of the triangles and circles on the blanket, and yeah, it's just incredible. And it's one of those things, because we're just watching it. I'm watching it just based on the iTunes HD copy of the film. So it because we're sort of as you're listening this, the movie will be out by now in 4K. So I actually can't wait to when the 4K comes out, to get our hands on it, to be able to just see how much more detail that we can get out of these films. So
I can't wait to get stills from the 4K. I can't wait to get those stills. It's going to be awesome.
And so yeah, I mean, it sort of ends just with the mystic, playing an instrument, sort of like a harp-like instrument. I actually had to look online on darkcrystal.com just to say, because on the script, I had to look at the post-production script that's on darkcrystal.com, and it was described as a harp. But then when I looked at the sort of the biography of these characters, and I worked out which mystic it was, and which is Art the Weaver, and it mentions that he's playing a loom. That the instrument is called a loom. So I thought it was kind of like just as part of the research. I'm like, okay, cool. But I think that probably I guess I'll probably wrap up for this minute of the Dark Crystal Minute. If you'd like to get in contact with the show, you can do so at darkcrystalpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/darkcrystalpodcast. You can check us out on Twitter at darkcrystalpod. We're also on Instagram at darkcrystalpodcast. And if you can give us a review on Facebook or on iTunes, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for your time, and come back next time for more The Dark Crystal Minute.